What is good, my family? It is your girl T, the nappy headed jojoba, here at long last with my review of Us. I shouldn't even call this a review, it's really more of a discussion because it will contain spoilers. So I know reading is definitely not fundamental on YouTube. So if you're coming up in this video expecting there to be no spoilers, this is not the video for you. This is more of a discussion rather than a review, or it is a spoilerlicious review. I am almost certainly the last person on the internet to be reviewing this movie, and it's not because I didn't see it opening weekend, because I did. I just really wanted to see it a second time. I had a lot of thoughts that were still kind of ruminating and percolating. And let me tell you, I am so glad I saw it a second time because my opinion on the movie changed pretty drastically. The first time I saw the movie, I liked it, but I had quite a few issues with it and questions. The second time I saw the movie, I loved it. It is regrettable that I'm doing my review of Us this late, like straight up on CP time, but I don't even care because I'm so excited to be doing this video today. Seeing the movie a second time was definitely well worth it for me to be able to have a real discussion with you guys. So here we go, our first Tea Talks Tuesday, that is a movie discussion and review. If you're unaware, on Tuesdays I like to do Tea Talks where I get to talk about anything I want. It doesn't have to be freaking conditioner. And let's get into it. Us is of course the second directorial effort from Jordan Peele, FKA of Key and Peele. With his first effort, Get Out, he basically drew a line in the sand. Get Out was a huge statement as to his versatility as a creative person. You know, he basically came out of the gates and said, look, I'm not just a funny guy. There's a whole lot more going on up here. I saw Get Out at a press screening. I was still actually working for a YouTube movie channel at the time. And oddly enough, despite how much I loved Get Out, I actually have not seen it again since that press screening. So I really need to get on that. Nonetheless, with such a fond memory of Get Out and such a high bar set with it, I was a little nervous going into Us because you see it so often where someone is sort of a one-hit wonder. Their first effort is their strongest, and everything they do after that is almost trying to meet that benchmark but not quite getting there. And that was to a degree how I felt with watching Us the first time. But now after watching it a second time, I as I said earlier, I feel like the movie is really, really smart and deeply cynical in ways that I didn't quite grasp on the first viewing. The first time I saw Us, I do feel like the twist at the end that Adelaide is technically Red and Red is technically Adelaide, and that Adelaide is actually the shadow. I feel like that punch had been telegraphed quite a bit. I definitely had a hunch that something like that was going on, that things weren't quite right, that Adelaide wasn't who we thought she was. But the experience of viewing the movie with having that thought as a hunch versus knowing it from front to back during the viewing process completely changes your experience and how you view everything that happens throughout the film leading up to that reveal. The two main speech scenes that Red gives in the film, I also feel played way better on a second viewing. The first time around, I felt like I was just watching some very heavy-handed, clumsy exposition. I mean, with those two speech scenes, and you've seen the film if you're still watching this video, you know which ones I'm talking about, where Red is almost like explaining the premise of the film or the plot of the film to us. It felt very much like exposition, which it is. But adding that layer of actually knowing who Adelaide really is and who Red really is on my second viewing made those speeches way much more interesting and way much more textured as a viewer. Taking into account what Red's perspective really is completely changed my experience and how I listened to those two monologues. Really, viewing this movie through the lens of knowing that Adelaide is actually the shadow, there's so many more subtle moments that went over my head the first time around. For example, when the home invasion first occurs and Red breaks into their summer home with her shadow family, there's that scene when we're all in the living room and we're actually about to hear that first big speech from Red, and Red sits in the chair across from Adelaide and we see Adelaide sit down compliant, that sort of puppeteering dynamic between the primary and the shadow. And on a second viewing, I noticed that subtle dynamic of Adelaide sitting because Red sat, because of course Adelaide is the shadow. The same goes to the ballet montage slash cross-cutting with the final showdown scene toward the end of the film, where we're seeing the teenage Adelaide and Red performing both above and below being cross-cut with the actual fight scene between the adult Adelaide and Red. That scene plays completely differently once you understand their actual relationship to one another, and it makes a lot more sense as to why Adelaide is so clumsy during that fight and Red is super duper graceful, actually, which is not the way that the other shadows move. The shadows are very much, very staccato and jagged and frenetic in their movements, whereas Red is as smooth as butter. And by the way, I definitely need that orchestral remix of I Got Five on it, because that needs to be my ringtone or something. There are definitely clues that probably will get by the savvier moviegoer on the first viewing, like why is Red able to speak at all when none of the other shadows can speak in English? That was certainly a clue for me, but on a second viewing, you realize there are so many other clues like that you might have missed. Us is also making a very huge statement about the importance of having eyebrows. It's so funny to me that one way in which they made the shadows look so creepy was by not giving them eyebrows. I think some do have eyebrows and some don't, but Zora's shadow, I think her name is Umbre, the daughter. First of all, that young actress's performance, I think her name is Shahadi Wright Joseph, if I'm correct. Her performance was excellent. In my opinion, she was by far the creepiest shadow just based on her performance, as well as not having eyebrows. I mean, that is truly chilling. But all around, the performances are outstanding. I especially loved Tim Heidecker's performance as his shadow. I am very well familiar with Tim Heidecker from Tim and Eric, Awesome Show, Great Job, and Tom Goes to the Mayor. And he, like Jordan Peele, is a comedy guy. And it was great to see him bring those touches of just weirdness that I'm very, very familiar with from him as he was playing his shadow. As long as we're talking about performance, I have to talk about Lupita, of course. And I didn't feel this way the first time I watched this movie, but after seeing it again, give Lupita another Oscar. Give this woman another Oscar, please. The nuances and thought and care that she brought to this performance, I think a lot of it will slip by you without knowing the twist the first time you watch the movie, but the second time you realize just how much thought and care she put into every moment. I think this is going to be a bit like what it is for me every time I watch Beetlejuice, where every time I see that movie again, it's one of my favorite movies of all time, like seriously top 3 movies for me. And Michael Keaton, that man should have gotten an Oscar for that performance, and the fact that he didn't is a travesty. As a horror comedy film, it was obviously never going to happen, but let's just hope the same thing doesn't happen to Lupita. After all, Jordan did secure the Oscar for his script for Get Out, so maybe the Academy is finally expanding their worldview a bit. I don't know. We'll see. I'm not going to hold my breath, but she definitely deserves some recognition for this performance. I also love that Red is essentially bilingual. Once she gets abducted and taken to the shadow layer by her shadow, she is there, until she's an adult, and she has to learn to speak shadow. And I imagine that her English and the way that she speaks, because I know Lupita was doing that affect on her voice, that's indicative of basically not having to speak English most of her life at that point. It's kind of like with high school Spanish or whatever. If you don't use it, you lose it. So that paired with just the trauma of everything that has happened to her, I think it does make sense why Lupita went with that choice, not only for the way that she spoke as Red, but just for the kind of clumsiness of the actual syntax of Red's dialogue. Anyway, I just thought it was cool to see Red basically bouncing back and forth between communicating with her shadow family in the grunts and noises that they use to talk amongst themselves, and then speaking English with Adelaide and the other, surface dwellers. The theme of duality is obviously hugely pervasive throughout this film. We have the repeated use of reflections with mirrors or windows. Of course, the idea that everyone literally has a doppelganger. Very early on in the film, when they first arrive at their summer home, we have that shot of the large plastic toy spider on the table, and then we see the smaller real spider crawling right out from underneath it while Adelaide is just kind of sitting there in her own thoughts. We have the theme of 11:11 with the Jeremiah 11:11 Bible verse on the sign that the guy is always holding, and then his double has the 11:11, I think, tattooed on his head, as well as When Adelaide is tucking in Jason that first night, he points to the clock and the time is 11:11. We of course have the twin daughters that Tim Heidecker and Elizabeth Olsen have. And we even have duality in young Adelaide's hairstyle. I mean, this is a hairstyle that I think every little black girl has had at some point, you know, that strong center part and two braids or twists or whatever on each side. But I don't think that that was just a random choice. I think even the idea to give her one braid on each side, to have two, that symmetry, that duality, that's just another place where, in my opinion, they took great care in crafting every element of this movie. And then of course we have the rabbits. I imagine there's been a fair share of discussion about rabbits. I haven't watched too many videos or read too many reviews on this movie because I wanted to have my own thoughts and make sure that I kind of came in clean for doing this video. I think the only reviews I watched were the ones from For Harriet and Adrian Expression, and I can't recall if either of them talked about rabbits and the symbolism of that, but the way I first thought of it was just with magicians, actually. It's the oldest trope in the world, the idea of the magician, you know, presto changeo, you know, making the rabbit disappear in one place and reappearing in another, when in reality, there are two rabbits. And of course, we have Jason, the son, with his magic trick, so he at least has an interest in magic with that lighter that never seems to work. He says himself that the trick is kind of bullshit, and I don't think he's able to do the trick the entire movie. So there is that whole angle of rabbits and magicians, and there really are two rabbits, not one. You're just made to think there's only one. And of course, the practical explanation for the rabbits in the film is that the tethered eat them. But I generally think that Jordan Peele just has a thing with rabbits because, again, I haven't seen Get Out since I first saw it at a press screening well over a year ago. But when Lakeith Stanfield first gets abducted at the beginning of that movie, the song playing on the car radio, the son's car radio, is like Run Rabbit Run. I'm almost certain of that. There's like a lot of rabbit shit going on with Jordan Peele. Another key symbol in Us is, of course, scissors. Again, I don't know how too many other people are interpreting this, but the way I look at it is scissors are a really interesting tool because what you have is two pieces that have been forged together to create a device that is made to separate something that is one, right? That's what scissors are. You've got the two halves of the scissor, which are connected, and then we use that to cut things into two or more pieces. And of course, we have several moments throughout the film where we see scissors being used, you know, even at the end when Red is cutting out the kind of Hands Across America, people holding hands kind of thing, that old school thing that we've probably all done before. So I just feel like there are so many different ways in which duality is explored. And the interesting thing is the tethers never look exactly like their primaries. I don't know what to call the surface dwellers, so I've just been calling them primaries for the purposes of this video. You know, beyond the lack of eyebrows and things like that, there's always something a bit off. You know, Red and Lupita have different hairstyles. Lupita's got the sister locks, or I should say Adelaide has the sister locks, and Red has her TWA. And this idea of things looking a certain way and therefore we believe they are what they're supposed to be is a huge theme of the film. Very early on, before the actual untethering begins, there's that scene when Gabe is on the bed and he's like ready to get it on, and Adelaide is obviously completely a million miles away mentally because she has this hunch that this untethering is coming, and she explains the whole incident in the funhouse when she was a little girl, and she says, I just don't feel like myself. And Gabe says, well, you look like yourself. Personally, I find that that type of dialogue was a little bit on the nose, but thematically it is pretty interesting in terms of what the themes of the film actually are about. Again, with things looking the way that we feel that they should, and therefore us believing that they are what they're supposed to be. Then later on at the beach, when Adelaide is talking to Kitty, and Kitty's just going on about inane nonsense, and Adelaide isn't really engaging, and Adelaide says, I have trouble talking. And initially it just seems like a funny way of being like, hey, can we just sit here quietly? But again, seeing this through the lens of knowing who Adelaide really is, that's quite literal. You know, she had to learn English around age 8 or 9 or whatever it was when she swapped places with Red. So she literally does have trouble talking because that's not her native language. She's ESL. Once the actual untethering begins, I thought it was interesting in the scene where Kitty, she's got her scissors. It looks like she's about to either injure or kill Adelaide, since Adelaide is cuffed to the bed. And then Kitty's shadow doesn't. It almost seems like there's an external force pulling her away, puppeteering her in a way like we see with Pluto and Jason almost. The most likely explanation is that Red has dibs, and perhaps Kitty's shadow is just like, oh, I'm not supposed to do this, let me back off. And then she, of course, heads to the mirror and takes her scissors and cuts her own face, almost as an act of contrition for almost crossing the line there and taking something that wasn't supposed to be hers. Adelaide's reaction to the deaths of Umbre and Pluto is also really interesting because, again, we know that she is a shadow person. So she's actually rather tender and almost pained when she sees Umbre dying in the tree. And when Pluto dies, when he's walking backwards into the fire, she's straight up like, no! Essentially ignoring her real family behind her, which eventually allows Jason to get abducted by Red. Throughout the film, on the first and even more on my second viewing, I noticed how much Adelaide favors Jason over Zora. She is far more protective of him than she is of her own daughter, and I'm not really sure what that is, though I have some thoughts, and that's why we're here today. For example, in the scene where the home invasion first occurs and they're all in that living room, Gabe is outside being useless, trying to crawl away from Abraham, who's kind of like towering over him and about to, take him on the boat or whatever. Meanwhile, inside, Red is running the show, and she tells Zora to run, knowing, of course, that she's going to send Umbre in hot pursuit. And when Red tells her to run, Adelaide tells her to go without a second thought. But when Red tries to send Jason off with Pluto, that's when Adelaide has a problem. She doesn't want Jason out of her sight. She was fine to send Zora off into the night, God knows where, but she doesn't want Jason to be even just a couple of rooms over. It could just be that Adelaide is more protective of Jason because he's her younger child, but I don't really think that's all there is to it. Throughout the film, Jason is wearing that mask, and the mask is a werewolf face. He wears it on top of his head most of the time, but sometimes he has it pulled down over his face. And again, this is another way that we're seeing duality in the film because Jason essentially has two faces. He's got the werewolf and he's got his own face. And the choice to make it a werewolf mask is very poignant in and of itself because what is a werewolf? A werewolf is a monster that has the ability to transform back into a human. The werewolf duality is that it is both a monster and a man. Pluto, Jason's shadow, crawls around on all fours, kind of like a dog or a wolf would do. That's obviously not practical because crawling is not faster than running. And the first time I saw the movie, I thought that that was just kind of a lame way of making him creepier without actually just having a good reason for him to be doing that. But on second viewing, I think perhaps it is to tie it into this idea of the werewolf, the monster, the man. Not to say that Jason is literally a werewolf, obviously, just the symbol of the werewolf and that duality. Jason also seems to be one step ahead of everyone throughout the film. Not really in knowing what to do, but being the most observant and the most perceptive. He points out the 11:11 on the clock. He finds the guy on the beach with his bleeding hand, which is a bit of a harbinger of all the things to come. He's the first to say, there's a family in our driveway. And throughout the film, we see him starting to put together that his mom isn't who we think she is. And by the end, we have a pretty clear picture that he kind of knows what's up. Gabe, on the other hand, the father, is almost completely useless. He's just kind of an oaf, and while he does manage to kill off a couple of the shadows and at least provide some distraction for his own shadow and Tim Heidecker's shadow, he literally says, your mother knows what to do toward the end of the film at the denouement. And I think it's really interesting that they shattered this image of the father as the protector of the family very early on in the film when they shattered his leg with Abraham hitting it with that bat. He spends the rest of the movie being pretty ineffectual and just kind of limping around, letting Lupita handle it. Interestingly enough, Zora also seems to be rather adept at killing. We have that scene where she kills one of the twin shadows in the bathroom, and she goes pretty primal, a lot like her mom, who has to kill the other twin again downstairs later on. Jason, of course, walks in on Adelaide in that really brutal moment, whiling out on that twin shadow, which is, of course, one of our biggest clues of everything that we learn later. We see Adelaide at her truest self moment after she kills Red at the very end of the film, because she truly has a moment where she just reverts to being that shadow person. Just raw expression and relief after finally untethering herself. Literally, because Adelaide is handcuffed almost the entire film. Her hands are either cuffed together or they're cuffed around a piece of furniture so she can't really be mobile. And Adelaide doesn't become unhandcuffed until the very end of the film, after she finally kills Red and is able to get the key to untether herself. It's quite on the nose. And that image of being cuffed is huge throughout the film, because we first see young Adelaide when she's been kidnapped by her shadow. You know, she gets cuffed to that bunk bed in the underworld. We get the t-shirt swap, and then both of their lives are changed forever. And then when Red says to Adelaide during that final showdown sequence at the end of the film, "You could have taken me with you," it has a completely different meaning when you realize who is who. But it also speaks to a dynamic that is very real and that we experience, I don't think just in this country, but I think throughout the world. More and more, I think people are showing their asses, and as more marginalized groups are trying to gain equality and get rights and get the things that the people in power have had for centuries, those people who have enjoyed that power and those privileges are holding on for dear life. The idea is equality is impossible, because for you to have more, I have to have less. So no, I can't take you with me. We can't both have everything. That's why people want to keep the oppressed oppressed. The fear is that if the oppressed no longer remain oppressed, then those with power, money, influence will have less power, money, and influence, and perhaps are then in fact in danger of becoming the oppressed themselves. Given the opportunity to live a normal life with sunshine and warm meals and comforts, Adelaide, who is actually the shadow, was able to thrive. She's got means, you know, they've got a summer home, she's got a family, they've got a piece of shit boat. And it is deeply cynical to me that this is essentially saying that given the opportunity, the oppressed would be able to rise to the heights of anyone else, and more importantly, to pass as one of us. There is no inkling to any of those around Adelaide that she was or could be one of these, you know, marginalized subhumans. For all intents and purposes, Adelaide isn't a shadow person any longer. But to know that she was, oh dear, that's the scariest thing of all. The idea that she could have duped all of us. Opportunities aren't given to people who are marginalized, who are beneath us, all under this farce of self-preservation. The young Adelaide couldn't have taken Red with her because it was in the interest of self. It's us versus them. At the end of the film, when Zora and Gabe are just basically hiding out in the ambulance, they see the Hands Across America of the tethered, and Zora says, "What is it?" And Gabe says, "It's them," which is essentially serving the purpose of saying, that's not us. Meanwhile, he's married to one of them and has children with one of them. Which brings me to my next question of perhaps Jason not being who we think either. Just jumping back to what I was saying earlier about how Adelaide is oddly far more protective of Jason than she is of Zora. Why is it that Jason is so intuitive about everything that's going on, you know, just a little bit ahead of everyone else, and even figuring out that the moment when they have that final showdown with Pluto before he gets abducted, he's the one who knows it's a trap and they have to get out of the car. Why is it that Jason's able to figure out how to puppeteer his shadow Pluto relatively quickly and actually uses it strategically in that showdown scene? In that same scene, we have Pluto snapping. Very, very evocative of Jason fidgeting with that lighter that he can't get going on that piece of shit magic trick. I don't know if perhaps there is a switcheroo that happened at birth. I don't know. Did Adelaide go back into the underworld and switch babies at some point for some reason? Who knows? Logically, that doesn't really connect, because if Jason is able to control Pluto's movements, then Pluto would have to be the shadow. But there's definitely something going on there where I don't think Jason is exactly who we think he is, even if he doesn't know it. And very importantly, the very last character shot of the film is of Jason pulling down his werewolf mask before we then, I think, cut or dissolve to helicopter shots of the shadow people tethered together, all holding hands in their red jumpsuits, doing their little hands across America. And the helicopter shots are over lots of verdant green land, and we see all those red jumpsuits, that line of them going like a vein of blood. It's just a really cool image, that vein of blood running through all that green land. Speaking of blood, throughout the film, Adelaide is the only one wearing this monochromatic outfit, right? She's wearing all white or all cream, but as the events transpire, she becomes covered in blood, which is almost like she's wearing her own red jumpsuit. You know, the rest of her family is in their, whatever house mismatched clothes, but she's got this monochromatic getup that becomes red with blood by the end, which of course hints at the red jumpsuits that the shadows are all wearing, again cleaving her to them and telling us that she is in fact one of them, even though she's also one of us. As for the practical questions of where the tethered all got these jumpsuits and sandals and fingerless gloves, girl, I don't know. Seems to me if they were able to get that organized to get matching outfits, they should be able to get something better to eat than raw rabbits. So there are a few just practicality questions that I have in terms of things like that, but overall, I think that this is a really, really interesting movie. If you saw it once and didn't like it, because I think that the response has been kind of hit and miss for a lot of people, I definitely recommend watching it again now that you know the twist. And I feel like I could talk about this for hours more, but this video has been long enough, so I look forward to talking with you guys more about it in the comments. But be sure to let me know as well if you want me to talk about movies that interest me more in other future tea talks, because some of you guys know that I've done a few hundred movie related videos for YouTube before, just not on this channel. It used to be a part of my job. I helped to launch a pretty successful movie channel here on YouTube, and I was running shows over there for a few years. So I've done literally a few hundred movie related videos on YouTube, and it's a little odd to me that I've never done one here on my channel, but it also makes perfect sense because this ain't no movie channel. However, as long as it's not Marvel or Star Wars, I might be down to talk about it. So let me know what you guys thought of this discussion slash review. And if you're not a commenter, just hit the thumbs up, and that's always a good gauge for me to know if people like something, because it's a lot easier to just do that than write a comment. But that's gonna do it for me today. Thank you so much for hanging out with me while I rambled on about us. Again, if you guys do want me to do more movie discussions when I see new and interesting movies, I will definitely try to get them out sooner next time. But in the meantime, I will see y'all in the next video. Bye-bye.
That's a nappy-headed hose there, I'm going to tell you that now.